Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Abe Denmark, Shihoko Goto, and Michael Kugelman. Abe is director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. Shihoko is deputy director for geoeconomics and senior associate for Northeast Asia with that program. And Michael is deputy director and senior associate for South Asia. They join us to discuss U.S. challenges in the Indo-Pacific as we anticipate the Biden administration. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having us.
This is a lot of Asia program firepower. So I really thank you, all three of you, for getting together for this. I thought before we dive into some specific topics or issues or countries, that Abe, it would be helpful if you could provide an overview of where the region sits right now in relation to U.S. policy and what some of the most challenging situations might be.
Sure. Thanks, John. I think the region is waiting for the Biden administration with a great deal of anticipation. I think there's not been a sense that, I don't think you ever get a sense of transitions where people feel good and reassured about things. I think there's always going to be a certain degree of anxiety. I think broadly, they're expecting a return to some degree of normalcy in terms of the mechanics of American foreign policy. That it's not going to be as transactional. It's going to return to the normal mechanics of dialogues and traditional mechanisms. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of questions in the minds of America's friends, adversaries, and everybody in between about what the Biden administration is going to do in terms of how it's going to prioritize its various interests. I think highest on the list is questions about U.S. policy towards China, how the United States is going to confront and compete with China in some areas. Yet there's also a sense that, or I should say an expectation that the Biden administration will want to cooperate with China in some areas like climate change and of course the pandemic. So I think there's a question about how the United States is going to balance those different approaches. Beyond that, I think the Biden administration and the people that have already been appointed to senior positions in the incoming Biden administration have talked a lot about revitalizing U.S. alliances and partnerships in the region, which I think is very much warranted. And the region and our allies and partners are looking forward to that. But there's questions, I think, about what the United States is going to be expecting of them in terms of burden sharing, in terms of what they're going to be asked to do. But I think most significantly, there's questions about U.S. trade policy and the sense that the Biden administration is probably not going to be joining into groupings like the TPP or RCEP. So then there's a question, what is our trade policy going to be? What is our economic policy going to be? If not that, it's clearly not going to be the transactional approach of the Trump administration, but it's still unclear about what the Biden administration is actually going to do. And that's going to pepper questions and inform how all of our allies and partners interact, from the closest allies that we have, like Japan, to even more distant partners around the region that want to see the United States engage, want to see us there, but also are unsure if we're actually going to be able to sustain and follow through on some of the things that we've said in the coming weeks, in the weeks before inauguration.
Thanks, Abe. Shihoko, the transition from on the trade issue that Abe just brought up, I want to ask you some questions about trade. TPP was dead in the water as soon as Donald Trump was elected, and probably would also have been had Hillary Clinton been elected, because she ran a campaign saying she would not be involved. So the U.S. decided to sit it out. Now we have the largest trade agreement in the history of humankind in the region. What is the possibilities, or what are the possibilities for the U.S. when it comes to trade pacts as we look toward the Indo-Pacific?
Right. Well, there are actually two major trade deals in Asia in play right now. TPP has evolved into CPTPP, which went forward without the United States. And there's also RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Both do not involve the United States, but it's also interesting. Neither is India part of it. So now RCEP is called, it should have included India, but it doesn't. TPP should have included India too, but it doesn't. So the United States and India are out of both of them. But if we focus just on what for the United States in terms of trade agreements, it's fair to say that the Biden administration has really put forward this issue of building up partnerships, working with like-minded countries to push back against China in particular, but to really come up with a trade framework that is more forward-looking, that addresses issues like the service sector, like digital technology. And these are of great importance to the United States and US businesses. So it makes a lot of sense, but there really isn't a lot of political appetite for the United States to move forward on new trade deals. And so when we look at the practicality of it, when we look at the congressional calendar, we already see that the ability for the United States to push forward a new trade deal is not really going to move forward in the near future. The ability for the United States to press the White House to be able to push ahead with a trade agreement will probably not happen before late next year. So the argument that this is important for the United States geopolitically, that it is a way for the United States to reclaim itself as a Pacific power, resonates well amongst analysts, but it certainly doesn't resonate very much on Capitol Hill. And in the business community, it's mixed messages. On the one hand, yes, there are lost opportunities for the United States, but on the other hand, there's not a lot of certainty as to what those rules may be in the future. Just one thing about CPTPP. The United States will probably be eager to join something like it, but it cannot accept CPTPP as it is, so it would want to renegotiate. And this really puts a lot of strain, not just on the US political cycle, but also in the United States' relations with the other member countries. So there's a lot of goodwill towards it, perhaps, but not a lot of ability to actually move forward. When we
Shihoko, what are the elements that make that deal unacceptable to the US as it stands?
Well, one of the things is it was a little bit circumvent on intellectual property rights. There's a lot of issues about pharmaceutical issues in particular. There's a lot of concern about data protection and data management, especially in cloud computing. These are issues that the United States will really want to push forward, and rightly so, I believe. But for CPTPP to have moved forward, these were issues that were not on the table at that time.
Thanks. Michael, in addition to economic cooperation and competition within the region, there are security issues as well. Recent news about China and Pakistan signing a defense pact. Could you talk about some of the security issues regionally that the new administration will be facing?
Well, sure. I think the main one is the war in Afghanistan. I mean, clearly, this is something that there's a fair amount of bipartisan support for drawing down the U.S. role there. And regardless of who was going to win the U.S. election, it was pretty clear that the next U.S. president was going to be focused on drawing down. So the Biden administration will take office in an interesting context in that the administration will inherit about 2,500 U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan, which is the smallest number of troops that have been there really since 2002, I believe. Now, Biden, very much like Trump, has been a strong proponent, or should I say a strong opponent of this notion of endless wars, of indefinite military presences for a long time. So, he's not interested in staying. He had never supported the troop surge that his old boss, Barack Obama, had put through. But the thing for Biden is that he has always looked at Afghanistan through a counterterrorism lens. For him, the main concern has been to maintain some semblance of a U.S. counterterrorism capacity to ensure that the likes of what's left of al-Qaeda and more recently the Islamic State terror group are not in a position to be able to plan and mount some type of major terrorist attack that would affect U.S. interests. So I think that the Biden administration will come into office and one of probably its biggest priority, a policy priority in South Asia initially will be on figuring out what to do. I do think that in the immediate term, you will see this administration invest a fair amount of diplomatic capital in trying to move this fledgling, fragile peace process along. But at the end of the day, what it's going to be focused on the most is figuring out what it would take to ensure that there will be a counterterrorism capacity, whether that entails working with the 2,500 troops that are left on the ground and basing it on that. That could be one option. But it may be the administration may be in a position where it has to figure out how to maintain that capacity with fewer or even no U.S. troops on the ground. Beyond that, Pakistan and India are always concerns. India-Pakistan tensions have been particularly sharp over the last few years, particularly over the issue of Kashmir. That has not changed, and I would argue that India-Pakistan relations are in a worse position than they've been in quite some years. India, of course, is a close partner of the US, whereas Pakistan is a more difficult partner. So I think that the Biden administration, its main goal will really be what most presidents' goals are, and that's to stay out of the disputes on the whole, but to do what's possible behind the scenes to encourage the two countries to ensure that their tensions don't spiral out of control, where you have to worry about some type of conflict.
Thanks. I'm guessing all of you remember a Time magazine cover literally decades ago with the Japanese rising sun saying that it's the dawn of the Pacific century. I'm sure you remember, or you certainly similar publications, right? So for decades, we've been talking about the rise of the Pacific. We used to call it the Pacific Rim, right? Now it's the Indo-Pacific region. The Obama administration talked about a pivot to Asia. And yet the United States continues to be drawn into the Middle East and seems to struggle with the notion of sort of the walking and chewing gum at the same time. What are your thoughts on this larger question of a focus on Asia and whether there really will be the kind of shift that we've been talking about for, as I suggested, literally decades? I'd like to get all your thoughts on that. Abe, could we begin with you?
Sure. With the Obama administration, we had the pivot, with the balance to Asia. With the Trump administration, we had the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. The logic is there, and the arguments for shifting American focus, American investments, and American military posture to the region has only gotten stronger over the past several years. The challenge, though, is that the United States has global interests. We have global responsibilities. And when you start talking about reducing American presence and engagements in a region, you're talking about increasing risks. And so far, it's been difficult for the United States to accept increased risks in some of those regions, especially regions like the Middle East. It's been shifting. I think that if you look at the Obama administration shifting the majority of American naval power to the region, the Trump administration shifting some military capabilities to the region, to the Indo-Pacific. Those have been happening, but when this really comes down, becomes challenging is when the U.S. starts to cut its defense budget. And then we have to make some really difficult choices and just accepting risk and deciding that bad things are going to happen and we're not going to do something about it. And so far that's been hard to do. Outside of the military sphere, there's still a lot of shifts that need to happen in terms of diplomatic power, in terms of how many diplomats we have in France compared to China, that sort of thing, as well as our economic capabilities, our economic focus. And lastly, just the time and focus of our top leaders, that there are key meetings that happen in Asia that the Obama administration was quite dedicated to attending. I think of the top leader summits, Obama attended 7 of 8 of them, whereas Trump, I think, attended 1 and left that one early. So I think there's the need to have that sort of thing. In terms of diplomatic engagement, the US has not had an ambassador to ASEAN since the Obama administration. I should say confirmed ambassador to ASEAN. So there's a lot of things that the Biden administration can do to shift its focus, to shift more resources to the region. But it's a project of more than one administration. It's going to take at least a decade, if not longer, and it's going to be a continuing challenge as Asia grows more important and as especially China grows more capable of potentially thwarting American interests and priorities.
Shihoko and Michael, I want to get your thoughts on this as well. Are we there yet? Shihoko?
That is a really interesting question because yes, the United States is a global power with many global commitments outside and both within and outside of the Asia Pacific. But what is really important is for the Biden administration to demonstrate that it is serious about the United States being a Pacific power. And we talk about the importance of the first 100 days of any administration. And a lot of Asian countries will be looking very closely as to how Biden will choose to use those 100 days to enhance its foreign policy and to really become, to engage with the Indo-Pacific. What's important to bear in mind is that the United States has been in flux a great deal over the past decade, but so too has Asia. And the United States cannot afford to wait. If it decides to wait out, prioritize other regions or other interests, either domestic or foreign, Asia will move on. We are already seeing an Asia that is regrouping without the United States. And so I mentioned earlier about the trade agreements that do not incorporate the United States. What this means more broadly is that Asian countries are working together to come up with solutions to issues that have long-term consequences for all of them as a region. And by that, they're gaining confidence of working together. They actually have this practical network and this ability to perhaps put aside differences and to work together on common goals. We will continue to see that. And the United States really cannot afford to be outside of that, especially when it is going to be when we do have to deal with issues that go beyond borders. And I want to mention this whole issue about COVID. Asia has looked with horror at how the United States has been dealing with the global pandemic. And it has also given Asia a lot of confidence about some of their approach to dealing with a pandemic. Here is the United States claiming that it is a country of innovation, a country that leads in the sciences and in technology, and yet it is unable to use those capacities to protect its own people. If it cannot do that, how are they going to be able to maintain its commitments on the security front outside of its borders? These are the very fundamental questions that are being raised in Asia at the moment. And therefore, showing up, being engaged, demonstrating, and not simply by words, but by action, to show that the United States clearly wants to be part of Asia's future will be very critical.
Michael, forgive me that we just got into this rhythm where you ended up batting third in the lineup. And so I know that you have to follow your brilliant colleagues who've already covered a lot of ground, but what would you add to this part of the discussion?
Oh, you're right. I have the easy part. I just
well, that's another way to
terrific
look at it,
colleagues. Right? No, I agree with what Abe and Shihoko have said. I mean, we've been hearing this talk about the U.S. becoming a Pacific power for so long, and for some time there's been a fair amount of skepticism in many capitals across the region, wondering about when the U.S. intends to follow through in that regard. But I think there are several good things going for the U.S. if you want to see it as a country that really is willing to pivot or rebalance or whatever the term you want to use. I think if you look at the Middle East, this is a region where traditionally the U.S. has been heavily engaged, heavily involved. But you look at dynamics over the last few years, I think that due to patterns of energy security and things like that, the U.S. is not as dependent on energy resources there as much, which I think reduces the need for it to be as engaged and involved there. The U.S. had been involved in a series of conflicts or wars in that region. That's no longer the case, and the incoming administration certainly does not want to start more wars. But clearly there are still key interests for the U.S. there, whether you're talking about key allies like Israel or key rivals like Iran or geopolitical volatilities like the Saudi Arabia-Iranian rivalry that'll keep it there. But you look at what the Trump administration did during its last 2 years in power. It did come out with a number of new promising tools that I think could help get the U.S. to a position where it could be that could enhance its ability to rebalance. The Development Finance Corporation and the Blue Dot Network, things like that are meant to stimulate U.S.-sponsored investment, particularly in infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region. The Quad arrangement, the U.S., India, Japan, Australia forum, so to speak, that has gotten a big boost as all of those countries have become increasingly concerned about China. So I think there is reason to be optimistic, but the proof is always in the pudding. And I think that this will be a priority for the administration, the Indo-Pacific that is, but we've heard this so much before that there's going to be so many foreign policy priorities for an administration that's also going to be looking at the significant numbers of domestic priorities, and we've already discussed some of them, such as the pandemic.
Speaking of the pandemic, right, you can't be ignored. It's sort of the white noise that is blaring behind any issue that we talk about. And is it, you think about some of the headlines prior to the pandemic, global headlines, what issues were dominating the attention of world leaders and the press, and many of them have sort of been muted or slipped into the background, but they haven't gone away. One obvious one is North Korea and its nuclear program. Abe, I want you to, if you could give us an update on that situation. And then Michael and Shihoko, if you would think about what are some of the other issues that are just waiting to jump to the front of the line when we get to a point globally where the pandemic isn't demanding the majority of our attention and resources?
Sure. So on COVID, I think it's just important to know how different some countries have been handling this. Just before we get to North Korea, that I was at a conference with some Asian partners a few weeks ago talking about a post-coronavirus world, and I was telling them I think they're further along than we are in terms of visioning that world. Just to give you a sense, in Taiwan, they've had 7 deaths from COVID.
7.
7. In New Zealand, it's been 25 total. So even accounting for differences in population, it's just an order of magnitude different than what we've experienced in the United States. And that's going to have a strategic effect for a long time. In terms of North Korea, the Trump administration, I think, does deserve some credit for some of the things that they've accomplished. First, in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, in their efforts to maximize power, they actually got China on board with some pretty heavy sanctions in ways that not a lot of us expected. Now, of course, China has kind of come off of those. North Korea's economy is hurting, but a lot of that now is because of it's closing off its own economy because of COVID, as much as it is the sanctions that the US and other countries have put in place. But despite what the Trump administration has done, they've sort of practiced these extreme versions of engagement and threats and threatening strategy to no avail. North Korea is no closer to denuclearization than it was 4 years ago. And in fact, it's had time to build more nuclear weapons, and its missile capabilities have improved dramatically, some believing that they've tailored their missile capabilities to get around the missile defense capabilities of the United States and its allies in East Asia. North Korea now, I think, is fairly clearly capable of striking the United States with nuclear weapons. And so the Biden administration comes into a North Korea that's more dangerous, that Kim Jong-un has built international relationships with world leaders that he didn't have 4 years ago. And the government in South Korea would prefer us to try to engage them rather than confront them. So I expect the Biden administration is going to try to rebuild the alliance with South Korea, with Japan, try to rebuild the trilateral cooperation that we had in the past with those two allies in an effort to enhance our ability to defend and contain the challenge from North Korea. But the negotiation has not gotten any easier. We're still no closer to denuclearization than we have been. And it's a real conundrum. And there's no clear way forward. There's no easy solution to any of this. Rather, beyond, I should say, improving our alliances, improving our military capabilities, and improving our ability to at least contain and address the threat and see how far we can get with a more realistic approach to engagement with Pyongyang.
Michael and Shihoko, I wonder, beyond some of the issues and countries we've already touched on, are there issues that are in your mind that you think are just sort of lurking in the background, waiting for their chance to be in the spotlight because of all of the oxygen that has been sucked up by the pandemic? Who wants to go first? Should we mix it up, Shihoko, and let Michael go ahead this time? Okay, Michael.
Sure. Well, I think there are a number of issues that had never really gone away, but they had always been lurking and indeed intensifying. One is certainly climate change. I mean, this is no longer something that we could just refer to as an abstraction. I think it's a clear and present threat to the world on the whole. It's one of the few issues where the world hypothetically can find common ground, and certainly the incoming administration will be very focused on that. And I think that it can look to Asia, to the Indo-Pacific. Everyone is affected by climate change. And certainly the region I cover, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, you're talking about one of the most climate vulnerable regions of the world. I think that toxic nationalism, democratic backsliding, that's something that we've been seeing for a number of years. That hasn't changed. This is something else that the Biden administration claims that it wants to tackle by elevating the notion of democracy promotion and human rights promotion to a key pillar of US foreign policy. But beyond that, finally, I think the notion of world order, this is something that's going to need attention. I mean, there's been many analysts believe that multilateralism has really struggled in recent years, particularly during the last few years when the Trump administration was perceived by a number of analysts as not really being interested in leading multilateral initiatives and not really being interested in leading at all. And yet, you look at the types of threats that this world is going to confront. We've seen pandemic, we're going to see climate change. These are global issues that require global cooperation and multilateral solutions. So I think there's going to be a need to focus on that issue.
Thanks. Shihoko.
Yeah, so we're getting towards the end of the tunnel, hopefully, in dealing with COVID as a health crisis. But unfortunately, I don't think the tunnel is anywhere near the end when it comes to the economic impact of the coronavirus spread. And well, one, as Michael said, we've seen this retreat of a multilateral approach. And I think this whole thing about deglobalization will simply accelerate in coming months and years. We've already talked about the slump in trade relations, in actual trade volume as a result of COVID. We've seen borders being closed. You know, the actual flow of people and not just goods and capital have really been impacted. And I think it's going to really change the way we interact with each other moving forward. Another thing is that we have seen the ability of the industrialized countries to stave off a financial crisis. But what we do see is this growing divide between those who have done very well, actually, during the pandemic and those that have not. And you see that in different countries, including here in the United States. But you will also see an increase in the North-South divide as well. And at the same time, there's a lot of concern about whether the existing multilateral international frameworks, most notably the IMF and the World Bank, are adequate agencies to be able to address some of the very great needs that a lot of countries will be facing. And this isn't just simply about liquidity, but also about technical assistance and also about preparing for other pandemics and other black swans, so to speak, in the marketplace. And then finally, I think we've already seen this happen, but digital nationalism, we're going to see a lot of barriers when it comes to technology. And we will see a lot of barriers coming up as we see a grouping of alliances in the name of national security, really putting up barriers when it comes to trade, as well as in cooperation of countries. So this is something that I will be looking at in particular.
Considering all of the challenges and opportunities that each of you have described during our discussion, when you think about the new administration and what it will attempt to do and what it will need to deal with in order to do it, do you think that the challenges it faces in the region are more about individual relationships and alliances within the region, or domestic politics right here in the United States? What do you see as the biggest barrier for Biden to overcome in that regard?
Why don't I start first? Because I think it's going to be it's the economy, right? So we're going to see this whole thing about the Biden administration before it takes on all of these numerous foreign policy challenges all across the globe. It really needs to focus on getting its own house in order. And that includes dealing with the pandemic, and it includes dealing with all the income inequality and social divide, as well as the fact that there is this ongoing tension and within the party politics of the United States. So this will probably use up a lot of the oxygen, and that's where the concern comes in, especially in Asia, about if the United States is so focused on dealing with its domestic economic challenges, can it really be a reliable partner? Does it have the capacity to be able to reach out to other countries?
Michael, you mentioned earlier the potential for troop withdrawals in Afghanistan. There's a prime example of where there is domestic disagreement in Congress on how to proceed.
Yes, well, I mean, I would think that on the whole, there's support for bringing the troops home, but indeed there have been some very powerful, prominent voices calling for the opposite. So it'll be a difficult case for Biden. But I think to get to your question, this administration is going to be under so much pressure because not just because of the political situation back home, where the administration will be needing to look at pressures coming from progressives within its own party, as well as conservatives from the other party, legislative challenges and all that. But looking overseas, this is an administration that has, or a campaign that has put out an extremely ambitious foreign policy plan to the extent that it's laid it out, talking about rejoining alliances and winning back friends and things like that. It's going to take a long time, and I think that there are some countries that are going to be watching the administration very closely to see how successful it is in doing that. But I think that there's going to be other countries as well that are thinking, well, that's sort of an arrogant thing to want to do. I mean, what if we don't necessarily want the U.S. to be the world leader anymore? So U.S. foes will take a very different approach to it. But I think the issue of expectations is critical for the administration, but also just the fact that, not only is President-elect Biden going to take power with some of the most significant foreign policy challenges that any administration has faced for some time, but it's going to be doing that at the same time that it's confronting multiple domestic policy challenges, several of them that are once in a generation type things. So there's just going to be a lot on the plate of this administration, and figuring out how to prioritize, where to invest the most bandwidth in the policy space. That will be a real challenge in of itself.
Abe, we're going to circle back to you for a final thought.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks for having us to do this. Three thoughts on this. First, this is an all hands on deck moment. The United States is in a pretty big hole, both domestically and internationally. I remember when President Obama was getting ready to come in, there was a book that came out by some friends of mine called The Inheritance, talking about what a wreck the world was in after the Bush administration. And I can't imagine how the discussion would have been if we told them that at the end of another administration, we'd have unemployment as high as it is and more than 3,000 Americans dying a day. So we're in a pretty big hole. The Biden administration is going to have to find ways to enhance and help the United States both domestically and internationally. And that comes to my second point, is that I think we often cast a pretty sharp divide between domestic policy and foreign policy without recognizing that these are actually quite intertwined. For example, if I were to devise a strategy for the United States to compete with China, one of the first points I would make would be that competition starts at home, that it's going to require a reinvigorated and innovative American economy, investments in things like infrastructure and education, all of which will buttress the ability of the United States to compete with China over the long term. Similarly, getting our domestic economy going will require access to foreign resources, to foreign markets. So I don't think that there's a clear distinction between domestic and foreign policy as the Biden administration tries to get us out of this hole. But the last point I'd make, I've participated in a lot of international conferences, and over the past 4 years, you get a steady drumbeat of concerns about the United States. And a lot of them are the usual concerns that we hear, not just about President Trump, but about Americans generally, about being unreliable and distracted and all the things that folks say when they're concerns about the United States. But at the end of these discussions, more often than not, almost every time, when they talk about what should we do, what do we do about all this, they say, we need the United States. That they still want the United States to come in. I think there's still the sense that only America has the ability to be a check against the Chinese, against the Russians. They see more engaged and more powerful United States as in their interests. And we're not just talking about allies. We're talking about partners and countries that are just concerned about China, concerned about Russia. And so they want to see the United States back. I say we're poised to lead, but we need to take that step. We need to make the right decisions to get us to the place where we can lead again with credibility, and with the power and vision that necessary to actually lead the international community in the future. Nobody wants China to lead. Nobody wants Russia to lead. I think it's either an American-led liberal order that we see going forward, or a more atomized order in which countries are just out for themselves, and we see just a much less cohesive sense of international community going forward. I think those are the real options that we have over the long term.
Well, thanks for getting us to a hopeful point, but a challenging hopeful point. It's not a linear situation. We have to rise to the challenge. Abe, Shihoko, Michael, I can't tell you what a privilege it is and a pleasure for somebody who's a generalist like me to speak with such deep content and area specialists as you. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
I also want to tell our viewers that, look, it doesn't begin or end here. If you come to the Wilson Center website and check the Asia Programs page, you're going to find so many resources from Michael and Shihoko and from Abe and from other colleagues who are part of their shop. Just this week, they did a major program on setting expectations or global expectations for the Biden administration. So there's that content and much more where this came from. So please do visit the Asia Programs website. And thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for a future episode of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll have a happy and healthy holiday, and we can all look forward to a happier and healthier 2021. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.